right now on News Channel 8 Today.
Good Sunday morning. News Channel 8 is your local election headquarters, and this is Politics on Your Side. This morning, federal officials continue to monitor tropical depression, Florence. The storm is bringing devastating floods and destruction to both Carolinas. It is now a tropical depression, but it's still pounding North and South Carolina, dumping even more rain on already flooded areas. The storm is responsible for at least 13 deaths now. There could be a total of 40 inches of rain in the southeastern area of North Carolina, and Southwest Virginia could be next, possibly getting up to 10 inches. This morning, more than 650,000 people are in the dark as power crews work to restore electricity. And rescuers have saved more than 400 people trapped in their homes by floodwaters. I imagine that number is rising by the minute. The president is thanking first responders for their work. He's expected to visit the Carolinas sometime this week. He signed off on a federal disaster declaration for North Carolina and an emergency declaration for South Carolina. It'll make the states eligible for much needed recovery funding, but will it be enough? An answer for what to expect could lie in Hurricane Harvey, a storm that also lingered once it hit Houston, leading to catastrophic flooding. More than a year later, some people are still waiting for money from the federal government. According to Dallas News, it racked up $127.5 billion in damages. FEMA has distributed nearly $14 billion in grants, low-interest loans, and flood insurance, and about $29 billion in public funds are being given to people, small businesses, and local governments. The paper says less than a quarter of the destruction has been covered by public funds. It'll be a while before we know just how much this destruction will cost for the states hit by Florence. They're still racking up as it continues to linger over the Carolinas. Storm Team 8 meteorologist Ed Bloodsworth has been tracking Florence from the beginning. And Ed, tell us how much devastation this has caused so far. I know we can't put a dollar amount on it.
Right, and really it's going to be quite some time before we really know the full extent of this, mainly for the simple fact that the flood event really isn't done yet. And we could still be dealing with flooding for potentially up to a week after this storm here. I actually want to go ahead and show you just sort of what happened with the storm as we sort of go back and look at the history of Florence. This is back on Thursday, and this was the problem. It slowly started to put on the brakes as it started to get closer to the coast, and then it made landfall Friday morning near Wrightsville Beach. But then it just sort of stopped, and it just sort of meandered. We saw this with Harvey last year, and unfortunately, you look at North Carolina, areas like Wilmington, Jacksonville, heading up towards Raleigh, they had prolonged periods of 24 to 36 hours where it just rained constantly. And we're not talking about light rain. We're talking about 2 to 3 inch per hour rainfall rates here. And again, that could really rack up as it rains that long. And that's why we're seeing these 40-inch rainfall totals in some isolated spots.
And that's what caused that 500-year flood after Hurricane Harvey in Houston, although we've seen 3 of those in just the past few years in that area. What can we expect now as the storm starts to move out?
Well, as we start watching this, it's now tropical depression, as you mentioned. So really the high wind threat is done. But let me go ahead and show you what the forecast track is going to look like. There's the latest from the Hurricane Center. Winds are now down to 35, but this will continue to pick up some forward speed. But you notice here, even through Monday and Tuesday, it is still over land, dumping rain as it does so over the Ohio Valley and then into the Northeast as well before this thing gets swept up in a trough and then finally starts to move out into the open waters. But this is going to be the concern. This is a river flood gauge map, and I marked all the areas in pink you see. Those are areas where we are already seeing major flooding. The Cape Fear River, the Neuse River, as you're well aware of this area being from this state, these areas could see some of their worst flooding ever recorded here. And a lot of these areas under that sort of moderate to minor flood stage, I think these flood stages will get worse because as we've been seeing, all of this water that is continuing to fall from the storm has to go somewhere, and it's going to run off into the freshwater river. So freshwater flooding, and even near the coast with the strong onshore winds, they're still going to be higher than normal tide cycles as we head into the next couple days. So again, it's going to take a long time before we know, but the most immediate concern now is making sure everyone is safe, staying in the shelters, and then eventually getting all the power back onto the residents.
Tide cycles and the rising of those rivers are going to to be the big story over the next couple of days.
Yeah, and this is certainly something we've seen in recent years. A lot of these systems are just producing more rainfall, even with Harvey. Again, that one also stopped, just like this one. But even on a daily basis, I think the big lesson to learn, the lesson learned from this is it doesn't have to be a major hurricane to cause damage. In 2001, Allison, a tropical storm, dropped over 30 inches of rain in Texas.
Ed Bloodsworth with a great insight right there on Florence. Thanks so much.
No problem.
This morning, President Trump continues to insist the death toll in Puerto Rico from Hurricane Maria was made up as a conspiracy against him by Democrats. A George Washington University independent study found that 2,975 people died as a result of the storm in the months after it. The U.S. territory updated its official count to reflect that number, but President Trump tweeted this past week that 3,000 people did not die and claimed those numbers were falsified by Democrats to make him look bad. Governor Rick Scott, Senator Marco Rubio, Representative Ron DeSantis all came out against President Trump's remark. It has been a busy week in Tallahassee. Let's get you right up to our Capitol Bureau Chief Mike Vasalinda to talk about Florida politics this week in the state's capital. Mike, both of the gubernatorial candidates, Andrew Gillum on the left and Ron DeSantis on the right, have sort of run on the right and left sides of their party, bucking prior trends that we normally see in Florida politics where these candidates try to come to the middle. Are they going to now try to come to the middle since we are in the thick of this general election campaign, or just keep going with the strategy of appealing to their parties and seeing which one works out the best?
Well, I don't think anyone can win this race without some of the non-party affiliate people voting for them. The question is what's going to make those NPAs choose one candidate over the other if they're both on the extreme. I would look, let's start here. Both candidates released their first ad of the general election this past week, and both really reintroduced themselves to the public. There were biographies. Ron DeSantis talking about playing Little League and being a champion from Dunedin, and Andrew Gillum talking about his grandmother's wisdom to always do the right thing. But we've talked significantly with Andrew Gillum about his strategy, and he doesn't feel like he's out on the fringes. He feels like he's within the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and pretty much that he is going to keep pushing the same things he's pushing, and he believes that will appeal to the middle as well. And to that end, you can't really question his judgment when you look back. The last 5 Democrats running for the governor here have all tried to move to the middle and been a little wishy-washy in doing it, and they all lost. So Gillum is trying something new, and we're going to see how well it works out for him. Right now, polls show he's got a small lead.
Yeah, and he has run all this campaign during the primary on that running Republican light is not the way to win. He continues to say that, and obviously it worked for him in the primary. We'll see if it works in the general. Mike Vasalinda coming to us from Tallahassee this Sunday morning. Thanks very much, Mike. We'll be right back, folks. A 2-year-old boy from Largo is now in his final resting place. Dozens of people said their final goodbyes to Jordan Belliveau yesterday at his funeral. Jordan's mother is charged with his murder. His death has caused a lot of controversy. He was in and out of foster care. His mother had a violent past, but regained custody of him in May. And now many people in the Bay Area are criticizing the system and demanding change. The state legislator who represents Jordan's district wants to change the law so something like this never happens to another child. Chris Latvala represents District 67 in Pinellas County, including parts of Largo and Clearwater. He joins us now to talk about Jordan's law. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. So what problems are you specifically hoping to address with Jordan's law?
Well, first and foremost, DCF, the average caseload for caseworkers, 24 cases each. I've been told by experts that the optimal level is around 10 cases per caseworker. So they need more caseworkers, number one. Number two, they have a very high turnover rate, so they need maybe a pay raise and more appreciation, so there's not the turnover that we've seen in recent years.
And I know that you're just sort of in the beginning of the fact-finding about this this bill. When we spoke earlier, though, you did mention that issue with caseworkers. Obviously, money's really tight in the legislature. Can you get the approval for something like this?
It's certainly worth a try. There are things that we can, maybe member projects or other, areas of the budget where, we can find some extra dollars And so I think, with a new, gubernatorial administration next year, regardless of whether it's DeSantis or Gillum, there might be different priorities. And I don't think that Rick Scott did a bad job with DCF. I think DCF, if DCF is successful 99% of the time, that's still not good enough, because one Jordan Belliveau that falls through the cracks is one too many.
Sure. You're running for re-election. Your opponent is Democrat Dawn Douglas. But like your father, you've broken with the Republican Party on a number of issues. You said you were proud of your D grade from the NRA at one point. You support equal rights for LGBTQ people, co-sponsoring a bill prohibiting discrimination for sexual orientation or gender identity. You've also opposed fracking, offshore drilling. What parts of your platform are in line with Republicans? Low tax, more personal freedom, less government. So on a lot of the big issues, I'm a proud conservative. Some people may argue, and say that I'm not a conservative. I believe I am. I believe in a large part of my record shows that, but I also represent very much a moderate district. 34% of my district's Republican, 34% is Democrat, the rest are independents. So I believe as their elected representative, my job is to go and be the voice of my district. And sometimes, my district doesn't like things that, a large number of my party supports. And so it's very easy, I think, to side with my district and do what I believe is right. Well, that certainly is your job. Those positions, particularly on the social issues,
sure.
There are a lot of people, especially independents, who say that they can't even look at the policy positions because they can't get past those social issues,
right.
LGBTQ rights, etc. Is this a new way forward? Is this where you would like to see Republicanism go?
Yeah, I think that, being for less government means being for less government, including in someone's bedroom. And so I think that, and Republicans are also supposed to be the big tent party. So I think we should be welcoming to everybody that believes part of our platform. There's a lot of members that are in the LGBT community that are fiscal conservatives. Part of being a Republican is being a fiscal conservative. So we shouldn't just eliminate them just because we don't believe in their lifestyle and the life that they want to live.
You took a lot of heat last year for House Bill 7069, which would disproportionately hurt schools in Pinellas County. You said you learned that after the vote. Isn't
Sure.
that something that you should have known beforehand?
That bill was a couple hundred pages. Some of the funding things that were, especially the part with Pinellas, even Pinellas didn't know until afterwards.
Okay.
And then they told us, and then we seek to address that. But it had to do with some of the charter money that they were getting and so forth. So there are instances where you can, vote for a bill that, and 7069, was a great bill, and I was proud to support it. I think it does a lot of good. It gives kids recess. It expands the Gardner Scholarship Program, and Best and Brightest for teachers.
Last question for you. Your father, Jack Latvala, powerful state senator, candidate for governor until late last year when his political career came to an abrupt end with some sexual harassment allegations. At one point, you defended him, saying these anonymous accusations are not true. We got about 30 seconds left. Anything you want to say about that situation? Do you still believe that?
Well, number one, I'm proud of my dad. Number two, he did great work for the Tampa Bay area and for the state of Florida. And number three, he still claims that he didn't do what he was accused of. And the state attorney in Tallahassee decided not to pursue charges based on the report.
Your son, do you believe him?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Okay. And the initial complaint that the Senate aide made, there are numerous holes in her story.
All right, I got to wrap it right there.
Yes, sir.
Chris Latvala, thank you very much for joining us.
Sir.
Appreciate that. Running for his House seat again in Pinellas County. We'll be right back, folks. News Channel 8 is your local election headquarters, and we're also your local NBC affiliate to bring you some national perspective on the big political issues of the week here in Florida and around the country. I want to bring in NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. Good morning to you, Chuck.
Good morning, Evan.
Now, Chuck, you're a Florida guy, so I know you keep at least one eye on Florida politics, maybe a side eye. This governor's race between Democrat Andrew Gillum and Republican Ron DeSantis is in the national spotlight nearly every day, and race has already become part of the race on several occasions. Right. President Obama now back out in public stumping for Democrats. We know President Trump supports DeSantis. Do you see this as almost a proxy election, Obama v. Trump?
I don't see it as a proxy of Obama v. Trump per se, but I do see it as a very telling race when it comes to the 2020 presidential. In this respect, as we've seen, the Democratic Party has its own. You know, both parties are in various stages of identity crises, if you will, and the Democrats are in one too. It doesn't get as much attention because of Donald Trump on the Republican side. But the question has been, you know, what are they? Which direction should the party take? Should they be a little more progressive and not necessarily worry about, quote unquote, the middle, the political middle, and instead excite the base? And exciting the base means talking more robustly about things like Medicare for all or what have you. And I think if Gillum succeeds and becomes Florida's first African-American governor, then in the most important state in presidential politics, that will send a message to Democratic primary voters and candidates that, you know what, a more progressive candidate can win. And you will see a more crowded race to the left in the primary. But if Gillum loses, then all of a sudden, Joe Biden of the world and other more moderate looking, maybe even a Michael Bloomberg, they start getting more attention. So that's the way I see it. It's more of it will tell us the direction and the comfort level of where the Democrats, because as you and I both know, if you can win Florida, you can win the presidency. If you can't win Florida, you can't win the presidency.
That's right. So it's more of a harbinger of 2020. That's interesting, Chuck.
Yes. Less proxy and harbinger.
Yeah,
yes.
No, that makes sense. The Senate race here between Governor Rick Scott, Senator Bill Nelson, also bringing in lots of attention and money. All the polling shows it's as tight as can be. What's the buzz in Washington about how close this race is? And do you think President Trump's comments about the Puerto Rico death toll will hurt Governor Scott?
Look, it could. I mean, I think that's why Governor Scott was, both Ron DeSantis and Governor Scott disagreed with the president's comments about Puerto Rico, but Governor Scott did it in a more aggressive fashion. And frankly, it's, I think, because Governor Scott doesn't need, you know, he doesn't owe his political career to Donald Trump. Right now, Ron DeSantis does. So I think that's why there was a difference in tone when it came to disagreeing with the president. But look, Rick Scott is the single most valuable Republican candidate running for office in the country for the Republican Party. Because if Rick Scott weren't running, the Democrats' path to control for the U.S. Senate would be even easier. It would be a much more of a direct line, and talk of Democrats winning the Senate would be, I think, more on the front burner. Right now it's on the back burner because, look, Rick Scott has got his own money. It's forcing the Democratic Party to spend more money in a very expensive state to do that. So, look, I do think President Trump put Governor Scott in a tough situation. He knows it. Let me tell you an interesting stat that ties both the governor's race and the Senate race together, and it'll tell you about the power of the Puerto Rican vote. I asked a couple of pollsters, is there a Gillum-Scott voter? I asked Democratic side and Republican side, and both of them said, yes, there is, and the person's a Puerto Rican. I think that tells you everything you need to know about why Governor Scott was so aggressive in distancing himself from President Trump's comments.
Fascinating. I mean, that voting block is going to be really interesting in this election. All right,
yes, it is.
Last question for you, Chuck. I want to get to you about Paul Manafort, the news on Friday that he will now plead guilty ahead of his second trial. He was at that now infamous Trump Tower meeting. President Trump has said he is considering a pardon for him in the past. How much does this affect the Mueller investigation, and how worried should the president be?
Well, I think the president should be quite worried, right? When you have, think about the people that are now cooperating with Robert Mueller. One is your personal lawyer of 10 years. The other person now is one of your 3 campaign managers from the presidential race. So of course, if you're the president, you're nervous. Here's the thing. I don't think a pardon does anything anymore. I think now the pardon weapon is just not as strong unless somehow Paul Manafort is just willing to lie on the president's behalf. You know, in his, quote, cooperation with Mueller. So, no, I think a pardon now is useless as far as the president's concerned, only could get political problems. And Yeah, I think the president should be concerned. I think it's a lot more to be nervous about because, as you noted, it's now an eyewitness to that Trump Tower meeting.
And we're getting closer and closer to the November election and still nothing from Mueller, so that will be interesting as well. Chuck Todd with some great insight. Thank you so much. We appreciate you joining us, Chuck.
Thanks, Evan.
He will have much more on Manafort and the political impact of hurricanes new and old coming right up on Meet the Press. We'll be right back.